A single mother and her daughter thought the worst thing that had happened to them was losing everything they once called home, until a forgotten house hidden deep in the woods revealed a basement that held secrets no one in their family had spoken about for decades, secrets that would slowly change the direction of their lives in ways neither of them could have imagined. The morning Daniel Whitmore died began quietly, the way ordinary mornings often do when nothing seems important yet. Laura Whitmore remembered the sunlight first, slipping through the thin curtains of their kitchen window in their small home in Maple Ridge, casting a pale glow across the table where her 10-year-old daughter Sophie sat swinging her legs while finishing a bowl of cereal. The coffee machine hummed softly on the counter, filling the room with a familiar warmth that had become part of their daily rhythm. Daniel stood near the sink scrolling through his phone, half-dressed for work, his jacket hanging loosely over one shoulder while he read something that made him smile briefly to himself. Sophie was talking about a school project involving cardboard models and paint that she insisted needed to be finished before the weekend, and Laura answered with distracted promises while rinsing dishes and watching the quiet choreography of their small family morning. Daniel leaned down to kiss Sophie on the top of her head, then touched Laura's shoulder in the absent-minded way he often did when he was already thinking about the workday ahead. "I might be late tonight," he said, the same sentence he seemed to say almost every morning. Laura nodded without really hearing the words, because they were so routine they barely felt like information anymore. He grabbed his keys from the counter and stepped outside into the cool air of early spring, the screen door closing behind him with a soft click. Laura watched through the window as his truck backed slowly out of the driveway and disappeared down the quiet street between the houses, then turned back to the sink and continued washing dishes, unaware that the life she understood had just ended in a moment she would replay in her mind for years. The call came before noon, from a number she didn't recognize, a calm voice speaking carefully as though each word had been chosen with great caution. There had been an emergency at Daniel's workplace. He had collapsed suddenly. The paramedics had arrived quickly. They had done everything they could. The sentence that followed seemed to float through the air without attaching itself to reality. Daniel had died before reaching the hospital. Laura stood in the kitchen holding the phone long after the call ended, the quiet hum of the refrigerator and the ticking clock suddenly sounding louder than they ever had before. Her knees gave out without warning, and she sat down on the cold kitchen floor, staring at the tiles as if they might offer some explanation for what had just happened. Later that afternoon, Sophie came home from school and immediately sensed the strange silence in the house. Children notice absence before they understand tragedy. She stood in the doorway with her backpack still hanging from her shoulders and looked at her mother's face with a seriousness that didn't belong to someone her age. Laura tried to find words that would make sense, but every sentence felt impossible to say out loud. Eventually, she told her simply that her father wasn't coming home anymore. Sophie didn't cry right away. She just nodded once and walked quietly down the hallway to her bedroom, closing the door behind her with a soft click that Laura would remember long after the rest of that terrible day blurred into fragments of memory. The weeks that followed became a strange procession of paperwork, condolences, and exhaustion. Neighbors brought food that Laura barely tasted. Friends spoke in careful voices about strength and healing while avoiding the empty chair at the table where Daniel used to sit. Funeral arrangements were made, documents were signed, and slowly the practical consequences of Daniel's absence began to appear. Medical bills arrived first, followed by letters from the bank reminding Laura about mortgage payments that no longer fit into the fragile math of her new reality. Daniel had life insurance, but not enough to erase the growing list of obligations that now belonged to her alone. Laura began working longer hours at the small cafe where she had been employed part-time, taking extra shifts late into the evening while Sophie stayed with a neighbor or quietly finished homework at the kitchen table. Months passed this way until the inevitable phone call finally arrived. The bank representative spoke politely but firmly, explaining that the missed payments had reached a point where they could no longer be ignored. Laura listened silently, feeling a strange mix of panic and resignation settle inside her chest. The house that had once symbolized stability had slowly become something else entirely, a reminder of everything she was struggling to hold together. By early autumn, they packed their belongings into cardboard boxes and moved into a small apartment in Cedar Hollow, a place that smelled faintly of cleaning chemicals and felt dim even in the middle of the day. Laura tried to make it sound like an adventure for Sophie, a temporary change while things improved, but Sophie seemed to understand more than Laura wanted her to. She had grown quieter since Daniel's death, watching her mother carefully and asking fewer questions about the future. One evening after a long shift at the cafe, Laura returned home to find Sophie asleep on the couch with a book resting on her chest. The apartment was silent except for the faint hum of the kitchen light. Exhausted, Laura carried her daughter to bed and then stood alone in the small living room staring at the boxes of Daniel's remaining belongings stacked in the corner closet. She had avoided opening them for months, afraid of the memories waiting inside, but something about the endless exhaustion of her new life finally pushed her to act. She sat down on the floor and began sorting through the boxes slowly, lifting out old receipts, manuals, and tools Daniel had once used for small repairs around the house they no longer owned. At the bottom of the final box, she noticed a thin envelope tucked between faded documents, the paper slightly yellowed with age. Her name was written on the front in a careful handwriting she did not recognize. Laura stared at it for a long moment before opening it. Inside was a letter written by someone named Arthur Whitmore, Daniel's grandfather, a man Laura had only heard mentioned once or twice in passing conversations years earlier. The letter was brief but strangely deliberate, describing a piece of land far from towns, hidden near the forests of northern Maine, where Arthur had built a small house many decades before. He explained that the property had been left to the family but had never been claimed, and that it remained exactly as he had left it. At the end of the letter was a single sentence written with quiet certainty. If life ever became difficult and there was nowhere else to go, the house would still be waiting. Laura read the letter again and again, feeling a slow shift of possibility forming in the middle of her exhaustion. Just then Sophie appeared quietly in the doorway, rubbing sleep from her eyes and noticing the paper in her mother's hands. "What is it?" she asked softly. Laura looked down at the letter once more, then back at her daughter, realizing that for the first time in months something unexpected had entered their story. "It might be," she said carefully, "a place we didn't know we had." A week after discovering the letter, Laura Whitmore and her daughter Sophie were driving farther from civilization than either of them had ever been before, following a set of directions that felt less like a map and more like instructions for leaving their old life behind. The highway eventually narrowed into smaller roads, and the smaller roads turned into long gravel stretches surrounded by endless forest in northern Maine. Laura kept glancing between the printed directions in her lap and the empty road ahead, gripping the steering wheel as towns slowly disappeared behind them. Sophie sat quietly in the passenger seat, watching the landscape change through the window as tall pine trees grew thicker on both sides of the road. After hours of driving, the final paved road ended completely and a narrow dirt track led deeper into the woods. Laura hesitated only for a moment before turning onto it. The car rolled slowly over uneven ground until the trees finally opened into a small clearing where the house appeared almost suddenly, as if it had been hidden there all along. It was smaller than Laura had imagined, but stronger looking than she expected. The wooden walls were weathered yet sturdy, and a stone chimney rose above the roof, suggesting that someone had once built the place carefully and with purpose. Laura turned off the engine and the silence around them felt unusually deep. Sophie stepped out first and looked around with wide eyes. "It doesn't look abandoned," she said quietly. Laura noticed the same thing. The house looked less like a ruin and more like a place that had simply been waiting for someone to return. When Laura pushed open the front door, the hinges creaked but held firm. Inside, sunlight filtered through dusty windows and revealed simple wooden furniture, shelves built directly into the walls, and a heavy iron stove standing in the center of the main room. Everything about the house felt practical rather than decorative, like it had been designed to last through difficult seasons rather than impress visitors. Laura walked slowly through each room while Sophie explored beside her, both of them trying to imagine what life here might look like. Behind the house, they discovered a small workshop filled with neatly arranged tools that were old but still in good condition. It was clear that whoever had lived here believed in preparation and hard work. Later that afternoon, while checking the kitchen floor for loose boards, Laura noticed something unusual beneath a rug. When she pulled the rug aside, she found a square wooden hatch built into the floor. Curious, She lifted the handle and slowly opened it. A narrow staircase led downward into darkness, and a cool draft of air drifted up from below. Sophie leaned closer and peered down. "Is that a basement?" she asked. Laura grabbed a flashlight from the car and carefully stepped down the stairs, the wooden steps creaking under her weight. At the bottom, she discovered a surprisingly large basement room with shelves along the walls and several wooden crates stacked neatly in one corner. Rows of old jars filled with preserved vegetables and dried food still sat in place, their faded labels barely visible after so many years. It looked as if someone had once prepared carefully for long winters. But what caught Laura's attention most was a metal cabinet attached to the far wall. When she opened it, she found several notebooks tied together with string and a small locked metal box resting on the shelf. Sophie crouched beside her while Laura untied the notebooks and flipped through them. Each page was filled with careful handwriting, notes about weather patterns, supplies, repairs, and sketches of the house itself. "Grandpa Arthur must have written these," Sophie said softly. Laura nodded and then noticed a small brass key taped to the inside of the cabinet door. She picked it up and unlocked the metal box with growing curiosity. When the lid opened, both of them froze. Inside were several envelopes filled with money, carefully wrapped and labeled. It wasn't a fortune, but it was far more than Laura expected to find in a forgotten basement. Enough to help them survive for a while. Sophie looked at her mother in disbelief while Laura opened the last notebook and turned to the final page. At the bottom, Arthur Whitmore had written one simple line. "If someone in this family ever needs this place again, the house will give them time to start over." Laura closed the notebook slowly, realizing that this hidden house might be more than just shelter. It might be the beginning of a second chance they never expected to find. When Laura Whitmore first found the hidden money and the notebooks in the basement, she believed the discovery itself was the miracle. But in the weeks that followed, she realized the true gift Arthur Whitmore had left behind was something much larger than a few envelopes of cash. The house had been designed carefully, almost thoughtfully, as if every beam, shelf, and stone had been placed with the expectation that someone else might one day need it. As Laura continued reading through Arthur's notebooks, she discovered pages filled with plans for making the property self-sufficient, diagrams for collecting rainwater, notes about planting vegetables that could survive the northern climate, and instructions for maintaining the small generator in the workshop. The money allowed them to drive into the nearest town for essential supplies, but it was Arthur's quiet planning that truly gave them the chance to stay. Slowly, the house that once felt strange and silent began to change. Laura repaired broken boards, cleaned the old workshop, and followed the notes in the journals as carefully as she could. Sophie helped wherever she was able, gathering firewood, organizing tools, and exploring the forest paths around the clearing. For the first time since Daniel's death, their days began to form a steady rhythm again. Mornings were spent working on the house. Afternoons in the garden Laura started behind the workshop, and evenings beside the stove where Sophie read while Laura studied the remaining notebooks. The loneliness that once followed them everywhere slowly softened. It wasn't that their grief disappeared. Daniel's absence was still there in quiet moments, but the house gave them something they had not felt in a long time: stability. Months passed, and the forgotten property slowly turned into a real home. The garden began to grow, the workshop filled with small repairs and new projects, and the basement, once dark and mysterious, became a place where Laura kept the supplies that helped them get through each season. Sometimes Sophie would ask about the man who built it all. "Do you think Grandpa Arthur knew someone would come back?" she asked one evening while they sat outside watching the sun disappear behind the trees. Laura looked toward the house, the workshop, and the quiet forest surrounding them. "I think he hoped someone would," she said gently. Sophie nodded, as if that answer made perfect sense. Over time, Laura understood something important. The forgotten house had never been meant to rescue them. It had simply been prepared to give them time. Time to recover, time to rebuild, and time to believe that life could begin again even after everything seemed lost. And in that quiet clearing deep in the woods, the place that had once been hidden and forgotten slowly became the foundation for a new future neither of them had expected, but both of them were finally ready to live.